The moment Frank Ford's knuckles hovered over that weathered door, something shifted in the air around him. Something that had nothing to do with the dry Wyoming wind that swept across the Sweetwater Valley, and everything to do with the fact that, in all his 29 years on this earth, he had never once hesitated before doing what he was told. He had ridden 3 hours from Rawlins under a September sky so blue it hurt to look at, with a folded letter in his breast pocket, and a set of instructions so simple that his employer, Garrison Holt, had laughed when he handed them over. "She is a woman alone," Garrison had said, leaning back in his leather chair with that smug ease that came from owning most of Carbon County. "She has no husband, no deed that will hold up in court, and no neighbors left to vouch for her. You ride out there, you tell her the valley belongs to Holt Cattle Company now, and you give her a week to clear out. That is all." He had slid an envelope across the desk, thick with money. "You are good at this, Ford. You always have been." Frank had taken the envelope without blinking. He had done this kind of work before, ridden out to failing farms and tired ranchers, and told them gently but firmly that the land they loved was no longer theirs to keep. He was not a violent man. He never threatened. He simply arrived, explained the legal situation in plain language, and let the weight of inevitability do the rest. It was work, and he was good at it, and he had never lost a night of sleep over it. Until now, standing on a porch made of hand-cut pine boards, with a brass door knocker shaped like a morning glory flower that someone had clearly polished very recently, listening to the sound of boots crossing a wooden floor inside the house, and feeling, for the first time in his professional life, an inexplicable urge to get back on his horse and ride anywhere but here. The door opened. Myrtle Sawyer stood in the frame, and Frank Ford forgot every single word of his orders. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman of that era, with dark chestnut hair pinned up in the practical way of a woman who had work to do and no patience for vanity. Her eyes were the deep brown of creek water in late summer, and they looked at him with a directness that he was not prepared for. She had flour on her left sleeve and a streak of garden soil on her right cheek, and she held a dish towel in both hands, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she already knows, somehow, that he is not a simple salesman. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was steady, unhurried, warm in the way of someone who had learned long ago that the world moved at its own pace whether you rushed it or not. Frank opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there in his good trail coat with his hat in his hands. When had he taken his hat off? He never took his hat off when he came on this sort of business, and he stared at her like a man who had just walked off a cliff and was still waiting to hit the ground. "Sir," she said again, a little line of concern appearing between her brows. "Frank Ford," he said finally, because his name was the one thing he could apparently manage. Yes, I am sorry. I rode out from Rawlins on behalf of," he stopped. The name stuck in his throat like a stone. "I have some business to discuss with you, Mrs. Sawyer," she said simply. "Myrtle Sawyer. And it is Miss, though I stopped minding the distinction some time ago." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "You look like you have been riding in the sun for half the day. Come inside and have some water before you discuss whatever business brought you all this way." That was the moment, Frank would later reflect, when his professional composure, the one thing he had counted on for nearly a decade, simply ceased to function. Because he followed her inside without a single protest, sat down in a chair at a table covered in a blue-checked cloth, accepted a tin cup of cold water from the well, and spent the next 20 minutes completely failing to say the thing he had come to say. The house was remarkable. That was the thing he kept noticing, detail after detail pulling his attention away from his purpose. It was a proper homestead house, not a claim shanty, 2 real rooms, solid walls chinked tight against the wind, a stone fireplace built correctly so it drew smoke up and out, shelves lined with books and jarred preserves in colors like amber and deep red and the bright orange of October squash. On the windowsill above the kitchen basin there was a row of small clay pots with herbs growing in them, and the whole room smelled faintly of dried lavender and wood smoke, and something baking slowly in the Dutch oven that sat on the cast iron stove. "You built this yourself?" Frank asked, before he could stop himself. Myrtle sat down across from him with her own cup of water and looked at him with those level brown eyes. "My father and I built it when I was 12 years old," she said. "We had just come up from Missouri. He had a deed for 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, filed it properly in Cheyenne, lived on it for the full 5 years and proved it up in 1878. She said all of this with the quiet precision of someone who had said it before and expected at some point to need to say it again. "My father died 2 winters ago. Influenza. I have been running the place alone since then." Frank set down his cup. "I am sorry about your father." "Thank you," she said, and then she looked at him with that clear, unblinking gaze. "Mr. Ford, you work for Garrison Holt." It was not a question. Frank met her eyes. "I do." "And you did not ride 3 hours out here to discuss the weather?" "No," he said, "I did not." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already known. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the valley. From where Frank sat, he could see what she was looking at: a long stretch of the most beautiful land in Carbon County, maybe in all of Wyoming. Grass still green in the low places where the creek ran, cottonwood trees blazing gold in the September light, the Sweetwater Mountains rising blue and soft in the distance. In every direction, the valley rolled out like a promise. "How many of the others have already left?" she asked. Frank thought of the 8 Homestead families that had been in this valley 2 years ago. He thought of the ones he had ridden out to see, and the ones his colleague Dobbins had handled, and the ones that had simply picked up and gone on their own when the pressure became too much. He thought of the Kettermans with their 6 children and old Svensson who had tried to file a legal objection and been laughed out of the county courthouse. He thought of all of them, and something in his chest did something uncomfortable. "All of them," he said quietly. "You are the last." Myrtle turned from the window. There was something in her expression that was not defeat, not even close to defeat, but rather a kind of resolved, clear-eyed acknowledgement, the way a person looks when they have known something was coming for a long time and have simply been waiting for it to arrive. "I see," she said. "Miss Sawyer." "Myrtle," she said, with a small, firm correction. "Myrtle," and saying her name felt strange in his mouth, not uncomfortable but weighted, like something that mattered more than it should. "I was sent here to inform you that Holt Cattle Company holds legal claim to this valley, and to advise you that you would be well served to vacate the property within the—" "He does not hold legal claim," Myrtle said, pleasantly but with absolute certainty. Frank paused. His lawyers are working with a fraudulent survey," she said. She walked to the shelf beside the fireplace and took down a leather satchel that had been wedged between 2 thick books. She set it on the table in front of him, opened it, and laid out a series of documents with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been organizing her own defense for quite some time. "This is my father's original deed, recorded in Cheyenne in 1873 and confirmed in 1878 when we proved up. This is the official government survey of this parcel, dated 1875, signed by the federal surveyor. And this," she laid down a third paper, "is a letter from the General Land Office in Washington confirming that this parcel is held under valid patent and is not subject to any competing claim." Frank looked at the documents. He looked at them carefully because he was a man who had learned in his line of work to read legal papers. What he saw made him go still. They were real, every one of them. The seals were correct, the signatures were right. The language was the precise bureaucratic language of the Federal Land Office. Garrison Holt's lawyers had told him the Sawyer deed was defective, that it had not been properly filed, that the survey was disputed. Sitting here looking at these papers, Frank could see that either those lawyers had been spectacularly incompetent or they had lied deliberately. And given what he knew of Garrison Holt, he had a strong suspicion it was the latter. "Where did you get the letter from the General Land Office?" he asked. "I wrote to them," Myrtle said. "In the spring. I told them what was happening in this valley, and I asked them to confirm the status of our patent. It took 3 months to get a reply, but they replied. She sat down again, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him steadily. So when you ride back to Garrison Holt and tell him that the Sawyer homestead is still standing, you can also tell him that I have documentation he is not going to be comfortable looking at. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the light was starting to slant gold through the western window, and the Dutch oven on the stove was sending out a smell of roasting venison that was making Frank realize he had not eaten since dawn. "He is not going to stop," Frank said finally, and he said it quietly because it was the truth, and she deserved the truth more than she deserved a comfortable lie. Documents or not. He has the county judge in his pocket and 2 of the 3 county commissioners. He has enough money to tie this up in court for 5 years, and even if you win every single case, the legal fees alone will break you. Myrtle looked at him without flinching. "I know that. Then, why are you still here?" The question came out more personal than he had intended, and he felt the shift in the air between them when he said it, something opening up, some conversational door swinging back to reveal more than either of them had planned for. Myrtle was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had changed slightly, lost the legal briskness and taken on something more honest. "Because my father broke his back building this place," she said. "Because he came here from Missouri with $60 and a mule and a dream that the Land Act promised, and he made every payment and met every deadline and did every single thing the law asked of him. And when he died, he left me this place, and he left me his word that it was mine, and I am not going to hand it over to a man like Garrison Holt just because Holt has more money and louder lawyers." She paused. "That is why I am still here, Mr. Ford." Frank looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then he said very quietly, "It is Frank." Something flickered in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something like recognition. Like 2 people on opposite sides of a river both noticing, at the same moment, that the distance between them is not as vast as the geography suggests. "Frank," she said, trying out the name the way he had tried out hers. Outside, one of the horses stamped and blew, and the afternoon light continued its slow golden turn, and Frank Ford sat at a blue-checked table in the last homestead in the Sweetwater Valley and made the quietest, most significant decision of his life. He was not going to drive this woman off her land. He rode back to Rawlins in the dark, which he never did. It was the kind of foolishness that got a man thrown by a spooked horse. But he needed the empty darkness to think. He had left Myrtle's house just before sundown, after she had, with a matter-of-factness that undid him completely, asked him to stay for supper since he had not eaten and the road back was long. He had stayed. They had eaten venison stew and cornbread at the blue-checked table, and they had talked about her father, about Missouri, about what Wyoming had looked like when she first arrived at age 12, and thought it was the most terrifying and beautiful place she had ever seen. About how she had learned to plow and plant and keep accounts and doctor the livestock herself because there had been no one else to do it. About how the valley had once had 9 families and had been the kind of place where people helped each other and celebrated together and knew each other's children's names. He had told her almost nothing about himself, but she had not pushed. She had simply listened and asked questions and refilled his coffee cup and looked at him with those direct brown eyes. And by the time he rode away from her lamplit house into the Wyoming dark, Frank Ford was in a condition he could not have named but which he could only describe as thoroughly disturbed, and not in a way he objected to. He arrived in Rawlins near midnight and went to his room at the Frontier Hotel without stopping at the saloon, which was another thing he never did. He sat on the edge of his bed and took the thick envelope out of his breast pocket and looked at it, and then he put it in the drawer of the bedside table, face down, and went to sleep without opening it. In the morning, he went to see a man named Abel Prout. Abel Prout was the only lawyer in Rawlins who was not on Garrison Holt's payroll, primarily because Holt had tried to buy him twice, and Abel had refused both times with the kind of cheerful stubbornness that made powerful men furious, and everyone else quietly admire him. He was 60 years old, Nebraska-born, with white hair and sharp gray eyes, and a habit of chewing on pencils when he was thinking. He also happened to have studied land law at a university in Ohio before the war, which made him, in Frank's estimation, the most useful man in Carbon County. Frank laid Myrtle's documents on Abel's desk. He had copied the key details from memory, not having been brazen enough to take her originals, and told him what she had told him. Abel read the notes carefully, chewing his pencil, and then he sat back and said, "You know, if her deed is what she says it is, Holt does not have a legal leg to stand on." "That is what I thought," Frank said. "The question is whether he needs one." Abel looked at him over the rims of his spectacles. "Legal legs are somewhat optional when you own the county judge. What would it take to go over Judge Carver's head?" Abel set down the pencil. "Federal court." "This is a Homestead Act, Pat. That is a federal matter. State courts and county courts have no real jurisdiction to overturn a federal land pat." He paused. "The nearest federal district court is in Cheyenne. Could she file a complaint there?" "She could file a complaint there," Abel said slowly, "but Holt has friends in Cheyenne too, and it would take months. In the meantime, he could apply pressure in ways that don't require courts at all." He looked at Frank steadily. "You know what I am saying." Frank did know. He had watched Garrison Holt apply that kind of pressure before, the kind that came in the form of fences cut at night, wells fouled, grain burned, and men on horseback riding through at odd hours just to remind a person that they were alone and isolated and surrounded by people who worked for someone else. He had never been part of it, had always told himself that his work was the clean part, the legal warning, the formal notice, and that what happened after was not his concern. Sitting in Abel Pruitt's office on a bright September morning, with Myrtle Sawyer's voice still clear in his memory, that particular self-excuse felt hollow in a way it never had before. "I need to think," Frank said. "While you are thinking," Abel said, picking up his pencil again, "it might interest you to know that Holt filed for a writ of possession last week in county court. Judge Carver will almost certainly grant it. That means a deputy could ride out to that homestead inside of 2 weeks and formally evict the occupant." Frank stood up. 2 weeks. Give or take. Abel looked at him with those sharp gray eyes. "I take it you are no longer purely on Holt's side of this matter." Frank picked up his hat. "I am not sure I was ever entirely on his side," he said. "I just forgot to notice it until yesterday." He spent the rest of that morning making 2 difficult decisions and one very clear-eyed assessment of his own character. The assessment was this: he was a man who had spent 8 years doing legal but morally questionable work for powerful men because the pay was good and the work was clean enough that he could sleep at night. He was not bad. He had never crossed into the territory of actual harm. But he had always stopped just short of the line where doing nothing became the same as doing wrong, and that line had moved on him yesterday without warning, and now he was standing on the wrong side of it. The first decision was to resign from Garrison Holt's employ. The second decision was to help Myrtle Sawyer keep her land. He rode back to the valley that afternoon, arriving at the homestead just as Myrtle was coming in from the field with a hoe over her shoulder and mud on her boots. She stopped when she saw him, and her expression did something complicated. A flash of something that might have been gladness followed immediately by the careful wariness of a woman who could not afford to trust too easily. "You came back," she said. "I came back," he agreed, dismounting. "Myrtle, I need to tell you some things that are going to be difficult to hear, and then I need to tell you some other things that might help. Can we go inside?" They sat at the blue-check table again, and Frank told her everything. About the writ of possession, about Judge Carver, about the 2 weeks she had before a deputy could legally arrive with an eviction order. He told her about Abel Pruitt and the possibility of a federal complaint. He told her about the kind of pressure Holt liked to apply when legal processes moved too slowly for his liking. Myrtle listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands flat on the table, looking at the grain of the wood. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because you deserve to know. You work for Garrison Holt." "I did," he said. "I quit this morning." She looked up at him sharply. "You quit?" "I left his employment and I returned the advance he gave me for this particular job." He paused. "I want to help you, if you will let me." The silence between them was long enough to be uncomfortable and honest enough to mean something. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like water, and a meadowlark called once from somewhere near the fence line. And Frank Ford sat across from a woman he had known for less than 24 hours and felt, with a certainty that was both alarming and completely unmistakable, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Why?" Myrtle said. The word was simple and direct, and she asked it the way she did everything, without performance, without manipulation, just a clean, honest question. Frank thought about several different answers and discarded all of them except the truest one. "Because you opened that door," he said, "and I could not say what I came to say. And I have been thinking about why that is ever since, and the only honest answer I have is that something about this situation, about you, about this place, about what is being done here got under my skin in a way I cannot explain and do not particularly want to argue with." He paused. "I know that is not a very professional answer." Myrtle looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled, a real smile, not the polite, controlled expression she had been maintaining, but something that reached her eyes and changed the whole landscape of her face, and Frank felt the effect of it like a hand pressed flat against his chest. "It is the most honest thing anyone connected to Garrison Holt has said to me in 2 years," she said. "I suppose that counts for something." The next morning they rode to Rawlins together, Myrtle on her solid bay mare and Frank on his roan gelding, and they went to Abel Pruitt's office, and Abel took one look at the original documents, which Myrtle had packed carefully in the leather satchel, and spent 45 minutes reading them with an expression of increasing satisfaction. "These are perfect," he said, setting down the last paper with something close to reverence. "This federal land patent is airtight. Myrtle, your father did everything exactly right. The question is how we get this in front of a federal judge before Carver's writ can be executed." He leaned back. "I am going to write to the Federal District Court in Cheyenne today. I am also going to write to the General Land Office in Washington and ask them to formally certify the patent status." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Can you stay here in town for a few days? I may need you accessible while I file the initial papers." "I cannot be away from the homestead for long," Myrtle said. "I have livestock. Is there someone who could look in on things?" "There was," she said, with a slight tightening around her eyes that told Frank there was a story there. "Before the valley emptied out." Frank said, "I can ride out and check on the animals each morning. It is not a far ride." Myrtle turned to look at him, and he could see her weighing the offer, calculating the trust it would require, measuring it against the practicality of the situation. "You know livestock?" she asked. "I grew up on a farm in Kansas," he said. "Cattle, horses, some pigs, I know enough." Something in her expression softened just slightly. "All right," she said. "But if my hens stop laying because of some disturbance, I am holding you personally responsible." Abel laughed at that. A genuine, delighted laugh, and Frank felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. What followed were 6 of the most peculiar and quietly significant days of Frank Ford's life. He rode out to the homestead each morning before the dew was off the grass, fed the horses and the chickens and the 2 milk cows, checked the fences that ran along the south pasture, and generally moved through the property with the practiced ease of a man who had grown up with land under his hands. Myrtle's homestead was, he discovered, a remarkable piece of work, every outbuilding neat and sound, the garden carefully laid out and showing evidence of years of improvement, the pastures managed with a skill that spoke of real knowledge and dedication. She had done all of this alone, or nearly alone, and the more he saw of it, the more his admiration took on that particular, almost painful quality of feeling something very deeply without quite having the words for it. In the evenings, he would ride back to Rawlins and stop at Abel's office to hear whatever news had come, and then he would have dinner at the hotel and try to read and generally fail, his mind drifting back to the valley with an insistence he no longer tried to resist. On the fourth day, Myrtle came with him to the homestead, unable to stay away from it any longer. They worked side by side through the morning, she at the garden pulling the last of the autumn squash, he mending a section of fence that had come loose in the overnight wind. And it was the kind of companionable, practical working together that Frank had not experienced since he was a boy, and which felt, under the wide Wyoming sky, like the most natural thing in the world. At noon she made coffee on the stove and they sat on the porch steps and drank it, and the valley spread out before them in the clear September light, and after a while Myrtle said, "Tell me about Kansas." So he did. He told her about the farm east of Dodge City, about his father who had died when Frank was 17 and left the farm to an older brother, about how he had gone north looking for work and ended up as a ranch hand, and then as a legal courier, and then, gradually, as the kind of man who carried difficult messages for powerful people, because he was good at talking and better at staying calm under pressure. He told her about the 8 years of that work and how it had felt, for most of that time, like a reasonable way to live. He told her about yesterday's version of himself and today's version, and how different they seemed from where he currently sat. Myrtle listened with her coffee cup held in both hands and her eyes on the middle distance, and when he finished she said, "My father used to say that the worst thing a person can do is to know the right thing and do the easier thing instead, because then you have to live with both the knowledge and the choice. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was," she said simply. "He was stubborn and principled and occasionally infuriating, and he loved this land with his whole heart." She paused. "He also always said that the land was never really owned by anyone, that it was loaned to you by God for a lifetime, and you had a responsibility to leave it better than you found it." She smiled at her coffee cup, which made it somewhat ironic that a man like Garrison Holt should want it so badly, since Holt has never improved a single acre of anything in his life. He just acquires. "He acquires," Frank agreed, "and he does not much care how." Myrtle looked at him sideways. "Were there others before the families in this valley?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "There were others," he said. "Not places I helped clear out. I told you I never did the rough work. But I carried enough legal notices to enough families that I am not going to pretend my hands are clean." She accepted this with a nod, not flinching from it, not offering forgiveness she had not been asked for. It was, he thought, one of the things he was coming to find most extraordinary about her, her complete absence of sentimentality about difficult facts. She looked at the world without blinking and dealt with what she saw. "Why did you never settle anywhere?" she asked. 8 years of riding for other people, you must have earned enough." "I kept thinking I would," he said. "I kept thinking there would be a right moment to stop, but there never seemed to be a place that felt." He stopped himself. "Felt like what?" He looked at her. The afternoon light was catching the copper in her hair where it had come loose from its pins, and she was watching him with those honest brown eyes. And Frank Ford, who was a man who chose his words carefully, and had been professionally trained in the art of saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing more, found himself saying something he had not consciously planned at all. "Felt like somewhere worth staying," he said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences between them. It had a charge to it, like the air before a thunderstorm, and Frank felt the color move into the back of his neck and told himself firmly that he was going to stop talking now. Myrtle looked away, out at the valley, and her expression was very composed, but her grip on her coffee cup had tightened slightly. "Well," she said after a moment, "Wyoming is not the easiest place to settle." "No," he agreed, "it is not." But neither of them moved off the porch steps for another hour. On the sixth day, Abel Prout received two pieces of news in the same morning, and he sent a message to the hotel before noon asking Frank to bring Myrtle to his office. The first piece of news was good. The federal district court in Cheyenne had agreed to review the matter and had issued a temporary order preventing any action against the Sawyer homestead pending their review. This was not a final judgment, it was a protection, a legal pause button, but it meant that Judge Carver's writ could not be executed until the federal court had spoken. The second piece of news was complicated. Garrison Holt had heard about the federal filing, which had moved faster than anyone expected, and he was not pleased. "I received a visit this morning from Holt's chief attorney, a man named Colbert," Abel said, spreading his hands on the desk. He was polite, in that way where the politeness is a very thin coat of paint over something considerably less pleasant. He suggested that it would be in everyone's interest if this matter were resolved without federal involvement, and he made certain implications about what life in Rawlins might become for those who insisted on pursuing it. "Implications meaning what exactly?" Myrtle asked. "Meaning that Abel Prout might find his practice difficult to maintain if he continued in this direction," Abel said, with a dry lack of concern that Frank found genuinely admirable. "And that other interested parties might find their situations uncomfortable." Frank looked at him steadily. "He mentioned me by name," Abel said. "He knew you had left Holt's employ and that you had been riding out to the Sawyer property." He paused. Holt has people watching, apparently. Frank was aware of Myrtle sitting very still beside him, and he turned to look at her. Her face was controlled, but he had spent enough days in her company now to read the small signs, the slight tightening of the jaw, the careful, measured breath. She was not afraid, but she was weighing something. "This is not your fight," she said, turning to him directly, her eyes steady. "You left his employ. You filed the papers with Abel, and that was generous and right. But whatever happens next, you do not need to put yourself in the way of Garrison Holt's anger on my account. You have your own life to consider." Frank looked at her for a moment. "Myrtle," he said, "do you remember what you told me about your father's saying? About knowing the right thing and doing the easier thing instead?" She said nothing, but her expression shifted. "I have done the easier thing for 8 years, he said quietly. "I am not inclined to do it again." Abel watched this exchange with the expression of a man who has seen quite a lot of human behavior in 60 years and was privately enjoying this particular variety of it. He cleared his throat. "Now that we have established that neither of you is going to sensibly back down, let us talk about strategy." The strategy, as Abel laid it out, had 3 elements. First, Myrtle needed to go to Cheyenne to appear before the federal court and present her documents in person, which would greatly strengthen the case and eliminate any possibility of the papers being lost or mishandled in transit. Second, Frank, who knew Holt's operation from the inside, needed to make a written statement about what he had witnessed in his 8 years of employment, which could be entered into the federal record. Third, Abel himself was going to contact 2 organizations, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association's Reform Faction, which had been increasingly vocal about land monopolization, and a newspaper editor in Cheyenne who had a history of being interested in exactly this kind of story. "Holt has operated quietly because no one has made noise," Abel said. "The moment there is noise, the calculation changes. He is a powerful man in Carbon County, but he is not powerful enough to ignore the federal government and a front-page story in the Cheyenne newspaper at the same time." "How long will it take?" Myrtle asked. "The federal review could take 2 months, Abel said honestly. "It could take 4. With the temporary protection order in place, your property is safe in the meantime." He paused. "Legally safe. I cannot guarantee that Holt will not try other methods." "He will," Frank said. "He will try the fence cutting and the harassment because that is what he does when legal routes slow down. He has men who do that kind of work." He paused. "Myrtle, I do not think you should be alone on the property right now." "I will not abandon my home," she said immediately. "I am not suggesting that. I am suggesting that having another person there, particularly at night, would be a reasonable precaution. The room was very quiet. Abel studied the ceiling with great interest. "Are you offering to stay on the property?" Myrtle asked carefully. "I am offering to stay in the barn," Frank said, "or wherever is appropriate. I would not presume to." He stopped because he was apparently capable of losing his composure in multiple different ways in her presence, and verbal stumbling was apparently one of them. Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The barn is cold in September. There is a good spare room in the house." Abel Prout suddenly became extremely busy reading a document on his desk. Yes, that would be fine," Frank said, "if you are comfortable with it." "I am practical," Myrtle said, in a tone that suggested that while she might be comfortable with it, she was going to be very composed about it, and no one was going to make a fuss. "Let us discuss Cheyenne." They left for Cheyenne 4 days later, Frank and Myrtle and Abel, in Abel's good covered wagon with a canvas top against the October weather, which had begun to assert itself with the sharp clarity of a Wyoming autumn. The trip took 2 days, and they stopped overnight at a way station near the Medicine Bow River, where the proprietor gave them rooms and supper, and the sky outside was so thick with stars it seemed to press down on the roof. They ate at a long table with several other travelers, and afterward Myrtle and Frank sat by the fire in the common room while Abel went to bed early, as was his habit. The fire burned low and red, and the other travelers gradually drifted away, and after a while Frank and Myrtle were alone in the warm fire-lit room with the wind making the walls creak. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," Myrtle said suddenly, in the way of a person who has been quietly thinking for a while and has decided to say the thing out loud. Frank looked at her. In the firelight he had been circling this fact for days and was tired of circling it, extraordinarily beautiful, not in a decorative way but in the way that comes from years of living honestly and fully, from having a face that matches the person behind it. "I used to want to be a school teacher," he said, which was the truest thing he could think of. "When I was young, before my father died. I liked reading and I liked explaining things to people, and I thought there was nothing better you could do with your life than teach a child to think clearly." He paused. "Then the farm failed and my brother took what was left and I went north looking for work, and the schoolteacher plan sort of went sideways." "You could still do it," she said. "At 29. Teachers are not required to be children," she said with that small private smile. "What stopped you from going back to it when you had the money from Holt's work?" "Habit, I suppose," he said. "And the fact that in order to teach, you need to stay in one place, and I had gotten very good at not staying anywhere." He looked at the fire. "And I think I knew, somewhere underneath, that a man should not be teaching children about integrity if he is spending his days doing work he is not entirely proud of." Myrtle was quiet for a moment. "That is a kind of integrity in itself," she said, "knowing the difference." He looked at her directly. "What do you want, Myrtle? If all of this works out, if the land is safe and Holt is stopped, what does the next 10 years look like for you?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "I want the valley to come back," she said. "I want other families to come back, or new families to come in, and I want it to be the kind of place it was when I was 12 years old and we had just arrived, and all the neighbors came and helped us raise the barn roof. I want a community. I want children running between the homesteads and women trading seeds and recipes and men helping each other with the harvest." She paused. "I want to expand the garden and try wheat in the north field next year. I want to breed my mare and start building up a proper horse operation." She stopped, as if noticing the scope of what she was saying, and smiled a little ruefully. "I want a great deal, it seems." "None of it seems unreasonable," Frank said. "What do you want?" she asked, turning it back to him. He was quiet for just a moment too long, and when he answered, he chose honesty over safety, which was becoming a habit around her. "I think I want what I have been riding toward without knowing it," he said. "Something that is mine, something real and durable, a place where the work I do matters in a way I can see and feel at the end of the day." He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had spent the last week mending fences and feeding livestock, and felt better for it than he had felt in years. "I think I want to stay in the Sweetwater Valley, Myrtle." The fire popped and sent up a spray of sparks, and the wind pushed at the walls of the way station, and Myrtle Sawyer looked at Frank Ford across the firelight and said, very quietly, "Then stay." And that was all she said, and it was, Frank thought, exactly enough. Cheyenne in October of 1883 was a city in the full flush of its territorial ambitions, wide, planned streets, the new Capitol building going up on its hill, the sound of the railroad and the cattle trade in every conversation. Abel navigated it with the ease of a man who had been practicing law in Wyoming for 20 years, and he led them to the federal courthouse with the purposeful walk of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. The hearing before federal judge Harmon Briggs took place on a Tuesday morning, in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and cold air, and the particular gravity of official proceedings. Judge Briggs was a spare, white-haired Massachusetts man with a reputation for no-nonsense jurisprudence, who had been appointed by President Arthur the previous year, and who, crucially, had no known connection to Garrison Holt. Myrtle presented her documents herself, standing at the plaintiff's table with the leather satchel and a composure that Frank watched with something close to awe. She was not nervous, or if she was, she had buried it so completely that not a trace showed in her voice or her posture. She presented the deed, the survey, the General Land Office certification, and answered Judge Briggs's questions with the precision and clarity of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 2 years, and was not going to waste a syllable of it. Frank's written statement was entered into the record by Abel, documenting what he knew of Holt's land acquisition practices in Carbon County, the pressure campaigns, the fraudulent survey claims, the judge shopping in county court. It was damaging and carefully specific, and Holt's attorney, who had traveled up from Rawlins in considerable agitation, objected to nearly all of it and was overruled on nearly all of it. At the end of the morning session, Judge Briggs looked at the documentation, looked at Myrtle, looked at Holt's attorney, and said, "The federal patent on the Sawyer homestead appears to be entirely valid. I'm going to take the matter under formal advisement, but I will tell you, counselor, that the burden of proof for any competing claim is going to need to be considerably more substantial than what your client has provided thus far." Outside the courthouse, in the cool October air with the mountains visible to the west, Abel shook Myrtle's hand and then Frank's and said, "That went better than I hoped." "Will he rule in our favor?" Myrtle asked. "I believe he will," Abel said. "But it will take time. The formal ruling may be 6 to 8 weeks out. And in the meantime, the temporary protection order holds," Abel said. "No one can touch that land while the federal court has it under review, and I have spoken to my contact at the Cheyenne newspaper. He is very interested in this story. Once it is published, Holt's ability to operate quietly in Carbon County becomes considerably more constrained." That evening, Frank and Myrtle walked through Cheyenne together while Abel rested at the hotel, and they moved through the city's busy streets in the way of two people who are discovering that the other person's company is becoming not just pleasant but necessary, like water or air, something you do not notice the absence of until it is there. They stopped at a dry goods store because Myrtle needed lamp oil and flour, and while she was speaking to the shopkeeper, Frank stood near the door and watched her and thought, with the simple, clear-eyed certainty that had become his defining experience of the past 2 weeks, that he was in love with her. It was not a frantic or overwhelming feeling. It was more like the moment when you come over a ridge and see a valley below you that you have been looking for, and you think, "There it is. There it has always been." When they came back out into the street, Myrtle was carrying a paper-wrapped parcel of flour, and Frank relieved her of it without discussion, and she gave him a look that was amused and a little grateful, and their hands touched briefly in the transfer, and neither of them made anything of it except that neither of them quite looked at the other for the next half block. "Frank," she said after a while, Yes. I want to say something, and I am going to ask you not to respond immediately, because if you respond immediately, I will not be certain you are being honest and not just kind." He looked at her, surprised. "All right." She kept her eyes forward on the street ahead and said, "I am grateful to you for coming back, for resigning from Holt, for everything you have done these past weeks, but gratitude is not that is not why I told you to stay." She paused. "I want to be clear about that." Frank was quiet, honoring her request, giving it the space it deserved. They walked another 50 feet, and a buggy passed them, and someone called a greeting across the street, and the October wind pushed through the city's avenues. Then he said, "I know." She looked at him then, finally. "I know it is not gratitude," he said. "I am not staying because you are grateful, and I am not staying because I feel obligated. I am staying because the valley is the most beautiful place I have ever been, and because your father's house smells like lavender and wood smoke, and because you look at the world without flinching, and because—" He stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face him on the crowded Cheyenne Street, and he looked at her directly, the way she had looked at him on that first day, with nothing held back. "Because I have been half-living for a very long time, and the first morning I rode out to check on your livestock, I felt more awake than I had in 8 years. And I think that has something to do with you and everything to do with you, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." Myrtle looked at him for a long, still moment. "You are making it very difficult to be composed," she said. "Good," he said. Something gave way in her expression then, not collapsed. Nothing so dramatic, just a careful, deliberate lowering of a guard that had been held up for a very long time by a woman who had learned not to rely on anyone. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, her fingers curling around the wool of his coat sleeve, and she said, "I do not know yet what this is. But I know I am glad you are here." "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They returned to Rawlins in Abel's wagon 3 days later, with the federal hearing behind them and the temporary protection order firmly in place, and the world had shifted on its axis in small, fundamental ways. Myrtle sat beside Frank on the wagon bench instead of in the back, and they talked the whole journey home, ranging across everything: history, agriculture, books, the nature of justice, childhood memories, the question of whether Wyoming would become a state in their lifetimes, with the ease of people who have discovered that conversation with each other is not something that requires maintenance or effort but simply flows, the way water finds its course. Back in the Sweetwater Valley, Frank moved his belongings from the Frontier Hotel, which did not amount to much, because a man who had been traveling for 8 years had learned to own very little, into the spare room of the Homestead house, and the two of them settled into a life on the property together that was, by the practical standards of 1883, somewhat unconventional, and by the standards of their own hearts, entirely correct. The work expanded to fill 2 people, which made Frank realize how brutally exhausting it must have been for Myrtle alone. There was a rhythm to it: mornings of chores and field work, afternoons of projects, evenings by the fire with books or conversation, or, increasingly, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had learned to simply exist together without needing to fill every silence. He took over the heavy physical maintenance, the fence work, the woodpile, the horse care, without being asked, because he saw what needed doing and did it, and Myrtle let him without making a performance of gratitude, which was one of the things he loved about her most. He had started using that word in his private thoughts. Loved. He used it carefully and honestly, examining it from multiple angles the way he examined legal documents, making sure it was what he thought it was, and not some simpler thing dressed up in fancier language. It was not simpler. It was the real thing, and it had happened faster than he would have expected and more completely than he had thought himself capable of, and he was neither alarmed by it nor inclined to rush it. The land was still under threat, technically, and Myrtle was still under enormous pressure, and the right moment for everything would come in its own time. In the 3rd week of October, Garrison Holt made his move. It came, as Frank had warned it would, not through courts or lawyers but through the blunt instrument of harassment. They woke on a Wednesday morning to find that the south fence had been cut in 3 places, and 6 of Myrtle's cattle had wandered through into the open range. It took most of the day to find and return the animals, and when they did, Frank rode the fence line and found boot prints and the marks of wire cutters at each break, very deliberately done. The next night, Frank stayed up. He sat in the dark on the porch with his rifle across his knees, not looking for a fight but making his presence known, and at around 2 in the morning he heard horses moving on the far edge of the south pasture. He fired twice into the air, not at anything, just the report of a gun in the dark making it clear that this property was watched. The horses retreated. Myrtle came to the door behind him in her nightgown with a lamp. "How many?" she asked. 2, maybe 3, he said. "They are gone." She stood in the doorway for a moment, the lamplight warm behind her, and Frank turned to look at her. They looked at each other in the dark Wyoming night, and Myrtle said, "Come inside, Frank. I will make coffee." It was such a simple thing to say. Come inside, I will make coffee. The absolute domesticity of it in the middle of the night on a harassed homestead in Carbon County, Wyoming, with a rifle in his hands and trouble still circling the edges of the land. He felt the warmth of the lamp and the warmth of her voice, and something settled deep in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. "Yes," he said. "All right." They sat up until dawn, drinking coffee and talking about everything except the men who had been in the pasture, and somewhere in those hours, without anything dramatic being said or done, something was decided between them that had been building since the moment she first opened that door. When the sky began to lighten and the birds started in the cottonwoods, Frank set down his cup and said, "Myrtle." She looked at him across the table. Dawn was coming in through the kitchen window and laying a soft gray light across the blue-checked cloth, and she looked back at him with those dark eyes that saw everything clearly and judged nothing unfairly. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly and not out of practical consideration or gratitude or anything other than what you actually feel." "I always answer honestly," she said. "I know. That is why I am asking." He took a breath. "I love you, Myrtle. I know it is fast. I know the circumstances have been extraordinary and that ordinary life is different from what we have been living these past weeks. But I have thought about it very carefully, and I am certain, and I am not the kind of man to be certain about something I have not examined from every angle." He paused. "I want to build a life here with you, on this land in this valley. I want to be the person who is here every morning and every night. I want—" He stopped, gathered himself. "Will you marry me?" The silence was brief. "Yes," she said, as simply as she said everything, as cleanly and honestly as she looked at the world. "Yes, Frank, I will." He reached across the blue-checked table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and outside the Wyoming dawn was cracking open like a brilliant door, and the meadowlarks were singing in the long grass of the Sweetwater Valley. Abel Prout, when informed, said, "Well, I could have predicted that from the first afternoon you sat in my office." He said it with considerable satisfaction, and went back to reading the letter he had just received from the Federal District Court in Cheyenne. The letter contained good news. Federal Judge Harmon Briggs had issued his ruling. After reviewing the documentary evidence and the record of the hearing, he had found the Sawyer Homestead patent to be valid in all particulars, that no competing claim had standing under federal land law, and that any writ of possession issued by Carbon County District Court Judge Carver in respect to said property was therefore null and void. Furthermore, the ruling noted that the evidence suggested a pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation in Holt Cattle Company's land acquisition practices in Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, and the matter had been referred to the federal attorney's office for further investigation. Abel read the key sections aloud in his office, and when he finished, there was a silence, and then Myrtle put both hands over her face and sat very still, and Frank put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, not crying, or at least not making any sound of crying, just sitting quietly with her hands over her face for a long moment while everything she had fought for settled into its proper place. When she took her hands down, her eyes were bright. "Can I see it?" she said. Abel handed her the document and she read it herself, every word, which Frank expected she would. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the leather satchel with her father's deed and all the other papers, and she looked up and said, "My father would have been very pleased." "Your father," Abel said, with great warmth, "would have been enormously pleased." The article in the Cheyenne newspaper appeared that same week, written by Abel's contact, and it detailed the methods by which Holt Cattle Company had pressured, harassed, and legally manipulated homesteaders out of the Sweetwater Valley over the preceding 4 years. It named Garrison Holt specifically and described the fraudulent survey claims and the relationship with Judge Carver, which was now under official scrutiny. The article was reprinted in the Rawlins Republican the following week. Garrison Holt, by all accounts, did not react well to any of this. He retained 2 new lawyers and made furious noises for several weeks, but the federal ruling was the federal ruling, and you cannot argue with a land patent certified by the General Land Office and upheld by a federal judge, no matter how much money you have or how many county commissioners you own. Within 2 months, the federal attorney had opened a formal investigation into Holt's land practices, and Judge Carver quietly recused himself from all land-related cases in Carbon County, and the particular kind of quiet dominance that Garrison Holt had enjoyed in the valley began, inexorably, to dissolve. Frank and Myrtle were married in November 1883, in the front room of the Homestead house with Abel Pruitt as witness, and a traveling minister named Reverend Cole, who was passing through Rawlins on his circuit and agreed, with evident pleasure, to perform the ceremony. Myrtle wore the blue dress she kept for special occasions, and her hair pinned up with a tortoiseshell comb that had been her mother's, and Frank wore his good coat and a new shirt that he had bought in Rawlins specifically for the occasion and was somewhat embarrassed about. Reverend Cole read from Corinthians and said some warm general things about love and endurance, and when it was done and Frank kissed his wife, the Reverend and Abel Pruitt both applauded, which none of them had planned but all of them felt was appropriate. That evening, after the Reverend and Abel had gone back to Rawlins, Frank and Myrtle sat on the porch steps in the cold November air, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall across the valley. It came down in large, slow flakes, the first of many, and it settled on the grass and the cottonwood branches and the fence rails and the dark-turned earth of the garden, covering everything in that clean, impartial white that makes the world look both new and ancient at once. "We should start thinking about what we want to do with the North Field," Myrtle said, after a comfortable silence. Frank laughed. He laughed because it was so entirely like her sitting in a wool blanket on their wedding evening in the first snow, already planning the next season's agriculture, and because he loved her completely for it. "In the spring," he said, "we can plan the North Field in the spring." "In the spring," she agreed. She leaned against his shoulder and he pulled the blanket tighter around them both. "Frank, yes, I am glad you forgot your orders." He turned to look at her, and she was looking up at him with those clear, warm eyes, and the snow was falling all around them, and the valley was quiet and white and entirely theirs. And Frank Ford thought that there was no version of his life that had been better than this one, no road he might have taken that led anywhere finer than this cold November porch, this woman, this land. "So am I," he said. Winter settled over the Sweetwater Valley in earnest through December and January, the way Wyoming winters do, deeply and without apology, with cold that cracked the boards of outbuildings and snow that piled against the north wall of the house in drifts shoulder high. Frank and Myrtle worked through it with the established rhythm of people who had already learned each other's pace and preferences. The long winter days divided between necessary outdoor chores and the warm interior of the house, where the stove burned steadily and the shelves of books got properly read, and the evenings were long and golden and full. Frank wrote to his brother in Kansas, whom he had not spoken to in 3 years, and received a reply that was guarded but not unfriendly. He wrote back and described the valley and the homestead, and the woman he had married with a specificity that he hoped would convey something he found difficult to say more directly, that he had found the thing he had been missing, the root hold that had always eluded him, and that he was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely and unambiguously at home. He also, during those winter months, did something he had been considering since October. He wrote to the county school superintendent in Rawlins, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Voss, and explained that he had some education and considerable experience in explaining complex matters clearly, and asked whether there was any need for teaching assistants in the area. Mrs. Voss wrote back with barely contained enthusiasm. The Valley School, which had been closed since the Homestead families left, could be reopened if there was sufficient population, and she was very interested in anyone who wanted to teach. When Frank told Myrtle about the letter, she looked at him with an expression that he had learned to recognize as the particular combination of warmth and satisfaction she wore when something pleased her very much. "You are going to be an extraordinary teacher," she said. "You do not know that. I have watched you explain things," she said. "The way you talked Abel through the survey issue, the way you explained the legal situation to me. You have a gift for making complicated things clear without making the person feel simple." She smiled. "Yes, I know it." By spring, 3 things had changed the shape of the Sweetwater Valley. The first was Garrison Holt's formal settlement with the federal attorney's office, which resulted in Holt Cattle Company being required to compensate several of the former Homestead families for losses incurred during the illegal pressure campaign, and the formal dissolution of Holt's claims to the valley land. Garrison Holt himself did not go to prison, which Abel Prout found somewhat unsatisfying and Frank found depressingly expected, but he was considerably poorer, considerably less powerful, and considerably less able to do to anyone else what he had done to the families of the Sweetwater Valley. It was imperfect justice, which is the kind that most often actually arrives. The second change was that the Ketterman family came back. They arrived in April with their wagon and their 6 children and their milch cow, and when Myrtle saw their wagon coming down the valley road, she went out to meet them on horseback with a jar of her apple preserves and tears on her face that she absolutely refused to acknowledge. And the reunion on the valley road was the kind of scene that made Frank, watching from the fence line, feel the full complicated weight of what all of this had meant and what it meant now. The Kettermans were followed in May by a new family named Albright, a young couple from Nebraska with a baby daughter, and a determination that reminded Frank very strongly of the Myrtle he had first met. And by June, 2 more families had filed homestead claims on parcels adjacent to the Sawyer property, and the valley was not what it had been before, not yet, but it was becoming something again, filling back in with human life and intention and the sound of children calling across the grass. The third change was the one that Frank had been watching for with a particular, quiet attentiveness since early spring, when he had noticed certain things. The way Myrtle moved with an uncharacteristic carefulness some mornings, the way the smell of coffee sometimes made her press her lips together and turn toward the window, the way she occasionally stopped in the middle of tasks and simply stood with her hand pressed flat against her abdomen, not obviously, almost unconsciously. He did not say anything until she did. She told him on a June evening, sitting on the porch steps in the last of the long daylight, with the valley green and warm around them and the cottonwoods in full leaf. She said it the way she said everything, directly, honestly, without ceremony, but with the full weight of what it meant evident in her voice. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. Frank was quiet for a moment that was not short. Then he said, "When?" "November, I think." She turned to look at him. "Are you Myrtle?" he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way he did not try to control. "I am more than all right." He took her hand. I do not have the words for what I am." "You usually have words," she observed gently. "Not for this," he said. "Not for everything you have given me, not for all of this." He gestured out at the valley, the green grass and the cottonwoods and the mountains and the sky and the house behind them with its smell of lavender and the pots of herbs on the windowsill. "None of my words are large enough for any of this." Myrtle leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the June evening spread out around them like a benediction. Abel Prout, receiving this news, bought a bottle of good whiskey and declared that some occasions demanded it, and Frank agreed that this was one of them, and they drank a glass each in Abel's office, and Abel said, for the third time that year, "I could have predicted all of this from the first afternoon," and for the third time Frank told him that was probably true. The summer of 1884 was full in a way that Frank had not experienced since childhood. The full that comes from genuine labor with genuine purpose, from the knowledge that what you are doing matters and will last. The north field that Myrtle had been planning since November was planted in wheat, and the experiment was a success. Not a massive yield, but enough to prove that the soil and the drainage were right, and enough to make Myrtle walk the field in August with her hand trailing through the ripe grain with the expression of a person who has seen a dream become real. Frank opened the Valley School in September, in the old one-room schoolhouse that had been standing empty at the edge of the Ketterman property. He had 7 students in the first month, ranging in age from 6 to 13, including 3 of the Ketterman children and the Albright baby's older cousin who had come to stay with the family. He discovered that Myrtle had been exactly right. He was, in fact, good at this. He had a patience for children's questions that surprised him, and a way of explaining things that kept them interested, and the sight of a child's face at the moment of genuine understanding turned out to be something that mattered to him in the deep, unreasonable way that the things that actually fit you always do. On a Tuesday morning in early November, Myrtle went into labor. It went on for a long time, as first labors often do, and there was a midwife in the valley now, a practical Finnish woman named Mrs. Mekinen, who had come with one of the new Homestead families and knew her work thoroughly. And Frank paced the kitchen floor for 6 hours, which Mrs. Mekinen found entirely predictable and declined to find amusing, and which Frank found completely unavoidable. Because all of his composure and all of his clarity and all of his considerable ability to stay calm under pressure had apparently deserted him entirely. At 3:30 in the morning, he heard a sound he had never heard before, the first cry of a new person in the world, and Mrs. Mekinen opened the bedroom door and said, with a warm practicality that he would remember for the rest of his life, "You have a son, Mr. Ford. Come and meet him." He was a solid, dark-haired boy who looked, in Frank's admittedly partial opinion, more like his mother than anyone had a right to, with dark eyes that blinked at the lamplight with an expression of profound assessment. Myrtle held him against her chest and looked up at Frank with a tiredness and a joy so thoroughly intermingled that they had become a single expression. And Frank sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her and looked at his son, and felt the full, complete reality of a life that had gone from hollow to whole so rapidly and so entirely that he still sometimes marveled at the distance between what had been and what was. "Thomas," Myrtle said, "after my father." "Thomas," Frank said. "Yes." He paused. "Thomas James Ford." "James, my father's name." Myrtle considered this and then nodded. "Thomas James Ford," she said. "That is a good name for a person." It was indeed a good name for a person, and Thomas James Ford proved to be, from his first months on earth, a person well worth having a good name. He was a round and determined baby who expressed his opinions loudly and slept in emphatic, total silence, and who looked at the world from his mother's arms with those dark assessing eyes, as though he had been sent specifically to audit its operations and form conclusions. Frank loved him with a ferocity that continued to surprise him. He was not, he had thought, the most natural father in the world. He had not grown up around babies, had no particular experience of small children outside the schoolroom. but Thomas fit into his arms with a rightness that was purely physical, purely instinctive. And the mornings when he held the baby at the kitchen window, watching the valley come alive in the early light, with Myrtle moving behind them at the stove, were mornings so full and so vivid that Frank sometimes simply stopped and held them in his mind, the way you hold something fragile and precious, fully aware that you are in the middle of one of the best things that will ever happen to you. By Thomas's first birthday, in November of 1885, the Sweetwater Valley had 8 Homestead families operating on their land, and the school had 14 students, and a post road had been extended up from Rawlins to serve the valley, so that Myrtle could now get her letters and her seed catalogs without riding to town. The wheat in the north field had done well for a second year, and Myrtle had begun breeding her bay mare with a neighbor's stallion and had her first foal in the spring. A chestnut colt with a white blaze that she named Doctrine, which she explained was because her father had always named horses after principles. Frank had argued, with affection and without success, that Doctrine was not a particularly encouraging name for a horse. It worked for Justice and Perseverance, Myrtle said, which were 2 of her father's former horses, and it will work for Doctrine. Doctrine grew into an excellent horse, which felt to Frank like a vindication of some kind he could not quite articulate. Abel Prout came out to the valley for Thomas's birthday, riding the post road in his rattling buggy, and brought with him a letter he had been sitting on for 2 weeks because he had wanted to deliver it in person. The letter was from the Wyoming Territory Assembly's Committee on Land Reform, and it thanked now Mrs. Myrtle Ford, née Sawyer, for her role in bringing the Holt Cattle Company's land fraud to federal attention, acknowledging that her case had directly contributed to legislation that was currently being drafted to strengthen homesteader protections in the territory. The letter was signed by 3 assembly members and included a formal note of commendation. Myrtle read it at the kitchen table while Thomas sat on Frank's knee and attempted to eat a biscuit with the focused seriousness of a child with important business to attend to. When she finished reading, she set the letter down and was quiet for a moment. "My father would have found this funny," she said finally. "He would have said he just filled out the right paperwork." "Your father," Abel said, accepting the cup of coffee Myrtle handed him, "would have been very proud of you, as am I, for whatever that is worth from a grumpy old lawyer." "It is worth a great deal," Myrtle said, and she meant it entirely. Frank looked at her across the table, over Thomas's dark head, and she caught his eyes and held them for a moment with a look that said everything. They did not need words for the gratitude and the love and the complete improbability of this life they had built together, and the absolute rightness of it, and the long, strange road that had brought him to her door with an order he had been unable to speak. 2 years later, in the spring of 1887, Myrtle told Frank she was expecting again. This time he did not pace the kitchen. He had reached, in the intervening years, a level of domestic competence and personal settledness that made the prospect of a second child feel like a gift rather than a catastrophe, joyful and practical and very much in keeping with the life they had made. Thomas, now 3½ and possessed of his mother's directness and his father's tendency to think carefully before speaking, was told about the baby with the solemnity the situation seemed to require, and he received the information, turned it over a few times in his mind, and said, "Will it be a girl or a boy?" "We do not know yet," Myrtle told him. He nodded slowly. "I would like a sister," he said. "They do not take your things as often." Frank, who had grown up with brothers, could not argue with this analysis. The baby was born in October 1887, delivered again by Mrs. Meckinnon with considerably less drama than the first time, and it was indeed a girl, as Thomas had diplomatically requested. They named her Clara Rose Ford Rose for Myrtle's mother, who had died when Myrtle was a child, and Clara because it meant clear and bright, which seemed right for a girl born into a life that had been fought for and won. Clara was nothing like her brother. Where Thomas had been solid and contemplative, Clara was quick and loud. with Frank's gray eyes and Myrtle's dark hair, and an absolute refusal from her earliest weeks to be anywhere other than the center of whatever was happening. She pulled herself upright against furniture at 7 months and took her first steps at 10 months, which Thomas observed with an expression of respectful alarm that he maintained for most of their childhood. She was, in short, enormously herself from the very beginning, and Frank and Myrtle found her completely delightful and occasionally exhausting, which is the correct way to find a child like that. The valley continued to grow. By 1888, there were 11 Homestead families, and a proper church had been built at the valley's center, and the school had grown to 20 students, and required Frank to petition Mrs. Voss for an assistant, which she found, and sent a young woman named Miss Harper from Ohio, who was kind and sharp, and got on splendidly with Frank, and fit into the valley life with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of place. Garrison Holt, in the years that followed the federal case, retrenched. He still had his cattle operation south of the valley, still had money and connections, but his ability to expand at other people's expense had been substantially curtailed, and the investigation that the federal attorney had opened had made him cautious in a way he had never been before. He and Frank never spoke directly, which suited both of them. Frank had no hatred for the man, had never found hatred a useful emotion, but he had no interest in him either, and the distance between them felt, in the wide landscape of Wyoming, entirely adequate. The injustice of what had happened to the Valley families, and to all the other Homestead families across the territory who had not had Myrtle's documents or Myrtle's determination, remained a real thing, not resolved just because one family had kept their land. Frank taught his students about the Homestead Act, about what it had promised and what it had often delivered, and what the difference between those two things meant. He taught them about land law and about the rights that came with being a citizen of the territory and eventually the state, and he taught them that knowing the law was a form of power that no one could take away from them, which he believed with the full force of his own experience. Myrtle, for her part, became the person in the valley that people came to when they had legal questions or documentation problems, because she had navigated the system herself and knew it from the inside. She helped 2 new Homestead families file their proper papers, sat with Mrs. Ketterman through a property dispute with a neighboring ranch, and wrote 3 more letters to the General Land Office on behalf of Valley residents over the following years. She did all of this with the same unhurried precision and the same absolute refusal to be intimidated that she had shown at 26, standing in her doorway with flour on her sleeve and a dish towel in her hands, looking at a man who had come to take her home and deciding, apparently, that he was not entirely beyond redemption. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, in November 1888, Frank woke before dawn and lay for a moment in the warm dark, listening to the house. He could hear the wind, which had come up in the night with the promise of early snow. He could hear Myrtle's quiet breathing beside him. Somewhere down the hall, one of the children stirred and was still again. The stove in the kitchen had gone down, but he could smell the faintest thread of wood smoke, and outside the cottonwood branches were tapping against the window in the wind. He lay there and let the familiar inventory of his life fill him up, item by item, the way it sometimes did on mornings like this one. The land, the house, the children, the school, the valley with its families and its fields, the woman sleeping beside him who had opened a door when he was 29 years old and looked at him with eyes that saw everything clearly, and in doing so had handed him, without knowing she was doing it, the rest of his life. He had been sent to drive her off the last homestead in the valley. She had opened the door and he had forgotten every word of his orders. It was, he thought, the best mistake he had ever made, the only one that mattered. He got up quietly and went to the kitchen and built up the stove, and put the coffee on, and stood at the window watching the first gray light come up over the Sweetwater Mountains, the mountains he would know for the rest of his life, the mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there long after, presiding over a valley that had been fought for and held and filled again with life and human intention, and the ordinary, extraordinary daily business of people choosing to stay in a place and make it good. He heard her footsteps in the hallway. He knew her walk by now as well as he knew his own, a particular combination of purpose and ease, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair down and her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and she looked at him at the window and at the light coming in over the mountains and at the coffee starting to breathe steam on the stove. "Happy anniversary," she said. "Happy anniversary," he said. She came to stand beside him at the window, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the quiet kitchen while the light grew over the mountains and the valley came visible below, all the way down the long green and gold corridor to where the cottonwoods stood along the creek in their brilliant autumn colors, and the homesteads were visible as small, steady shapes in the morning, the rooftops and the smoke of them, and the Ketterman place with its big barn, and the new church, and the schoolhouse, and the road that ran through all of it, connecting them together. Thomas appeared in the doorway at 6 years old with his dark eyes and his serious face, assessed the situation, and went directly to his usual chair at the table, because he was a child who understood the importance of breakfast. Clara appeared 12 seconds later at 2 years old, moving at her characteristic speed and direction, and was intercepted by her father before she could climb the shelves, and deposited in her chair with a resigned authority that she accepted only because she had already seen the cornmeal mush Myrtle was beginning to make, which was her favorite. The kitchen filled with morning noise and warmth and the smell of coffee and mush and wood smoke, and Frank Ford stood in the middle of it, this man who had spent 8 years with nothing to call his own, no roots, no home, carrying difficult messages for difficult men across the empty miles of the West, and felt the full, complete weight of what it meant to have found the place you were meant to be. He had forgotten his orders. He had stayed. He had built something real and good and durable, with a woman whose love was as honest and forthright and unadorned as the land she had refused to surrender. And in the Sweetwater Valley, the smoke rose straight and white from the homestead chimneys in the November cold, and the mountains stood, and the cottonwoods blazed gold, and the meadowlarks would come back in the spring, as they always did, as they always would, singing at the fence posts of a valley that had been worth fighting for and was now completely and permanently home.